Early voting begins this week here in Texas, and we all prepare to cast our ballots to decide what we want for the future of our country. It is just as important to look back and learn from those who have led the nation before us. Many great men have taken that solemn oath of office, including President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in his first inaugural address stated that we the people elect leaders not to rule, but to serve. Hello everyone, I'm Kirsten Cullenberg, Programs Manager at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Normally, I'm one of the members of our team behind the scenes producing these webinars, but today it is my pleasure to welcome you all. Today we have with us Susan Eisenhower, who is the granddaughter of President Eisenhower and author of How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions. Of course, you can purchase your copy of How Ike Led at interrobangbooks.com. Interrobang is one of our strategic partners at the council and a local bookstore here in Dallas. And as always, you can, our members do know this, if you use the code dfwworld at checkout on their online store, you can get 10% off your purchase, not just of How Ike Led, but of any of the books that are in your cart. I want to take a second to thank our promotional partners for this program, which include the Texas Historical Commission, the Georgetown Alumni Club of DFW. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of the people and companies who have sponsored our webinars this year. As things have been kind of crazy, we've taken a season to gather together online. So I want to thank our sponsors for helping to make that possible. And if you would like to sponsor a program, feel free to reach out to any of us at the council. We'd be happy to facilitate that for you. You can view all of our upcoming programs at dfwworld.org. And if you've missed any of our past programs and you'd like to catch up, visit YouTube. Our channel name is DFW World, and all of our programs are recorded and posted to our YouTube account a few days after we record them. And now I'd like to introduce Beth Huddleston, who will be moderating today's discussion. Beth is Executive Vice President here at the World Affairs Council and has served as Chief of Protocol for the City of Dallas since 2003. She earned her BA in Spanish and English Literature from Vanderbilt and holds an MA in Latin American Studies from Georgetown. Beth is an expert on Sun Tzu's Art of War, and I'm sure we'll hear some of her little tidbits from Sun Tzu today during the program with Susan. So thank you so much, Beth. I'll pass it to you.
Kirsten, that was an excellent introduction. Thank you. I know we have so many programs coming up, but today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Susan Eisenhower. Amazing woman. She is a consultant, author, and Washington, D.C. based strategist. She is the current president and chairman of the Eisenhower Group, a consulting firm which has advised Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. and abroad. Susan also serves in a variety of other roles, including being the chairman emeritus at the Eisenhower Institute of Gettysburg College. And I look forward to hearing more about the work that they do. She's co-chairman of the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board and serves on MIT's Energy Initiative and Advisory Board. And so she has just written a book, as we've heard, called How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions. It is her 5th book, and she also got an incredible review on the back of the jacket cover from Robert Gates, Dr. Robert Gates, who was just here in Dallas for our Big Malin dinner. And he wrote an incredible review, and as she said, he read every word of it, which I think really speaks very highly of the book. And I read the book, and it is an amazing look into the life of President Eisenhower. I just wanted to start out, Susan, and welcome. We're so thrilled to have you here. I just wanted to start out by talking about what it was like to be the granddaughter of such a legendary figure.
Well, first of all, Beth, thank you very much, everyone, for this wonderful opportunity to be here at the Dallas World Affairs Council. And I look forward to coming back sometime when we can all be together in person, but this is a wonderful opportunity. Well, you know, this book has been called many things. I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. But, you know, it does occasionally have a small appearance by me and my family members, largely to add some insight into how Ike led that have not been necessarily available to scholars. And, you know, it was sort of fun making those inserts. It's sort of hard to know how to say what it was like to be his granddaughter. We had a very normal family life, I mean, given the circumstances, but all you had to do is step out the door and realize there was nothing normal about an upbringing when you had Secret Service protection for 8 years, and everywhere you went, General Eisenhower and then President Eisenhower was mobbed. He couldn't even go out and play golf at his favorite country club without having people wanting his autograph and signing up to see him. In any case, we did have a normal life, but we were taught to compartmentalize our family life from Dwight Eisenhower's career, which was a long career, an astonishing career, actually. And so this is the first time I tried to put these two elements of his life together, his family life to some degree, because it's a reflection of his character, and also the events he was a part of and helped shape.
I think that's just such a great introduction to the book. And as it was called, a sampling, and really not trying to be a biography. And in each of the points about his principles, you brought in something personal and then something that shaped the world. And I just was very interested that he was brought up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And I was wondering what you felt, maybe that, obviously Gettysburg and everything that happened in that area during wars that we've had. Do you feel like any of that led to some of his principles of leadership?
Well, actually, I don't mean to correct you here, but he was born just down the road from Dallas in Denison, Texas. You can actually see the birthplace there, and spent his childhood in Abilene, Kansas. But I think there are a couple of things here. Going to West Point made a significant difference in the way he looked at the world, because what I tried to do in this book, and the reason I handled it thematically, was to underscore the fact that Dwight Eisenhower, the general, and Dwight Eisenhower, the president, was one and the same person. We have scholarship on his wartime years and different scholarship on his presidency, but I wanted people to understand how he looked at solving problems. And President Eisenhower used a lot of his background during World War II to inform his decision making. Now, that picture you just showed was of Eisenhower and his family. He was one of 7 boys, 6 surviving. Can you imagine, Beth, what my great-grandmother had to endure here when they were all young? And so Ike's there in the middle, surrounded by, standing next to his brother, who I enjoyed adding into this book significantly, because Edgar Eisenhower was the stand-in for very, very conservative thinking, and challenged his middle-of-the-road brother, who was the president of the United States, all the time. Then on the extreme right, you'll see Milton Eisenhower, who was more liberal than Edgar. And 2 of them were offering the president advice constantly. And I think Ike, being the middle child, had a middle of the road perspective, and understood that the only way his mother and family functioned was to bring the 2 of these guys together, to find solutions, not just at home, but also in a much broader way in public policy and beyond.
Well, it sounds like he learned a lot of his diplomatic skills in being in a family with that many boys and navigating between all the different ways. And I do want to talk about the middle way, but I thought maybe we could start with some of the decisions that he had to make during World War II. And really, I've certainly known about President Eisenhower my whole life. That was the president of my parents' generation, but reading it, I just couldn't help but getting goosebumps that I feel like he and the people that he led, for all intents and purposes, saved the world. And so I just hoping you share maybe a couple of stories about the Operation Overlord and D-Day. I know you go back often to commemorate that occurrence and what he had to go through during those times.
Well, Beth, thank you for that. And may I also say you're absolutely correct that Eisenhower was deeply impressed by Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. A lot of people don't realize that in 1918, he was commanding a tank corps at Camp Colt in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And at the age of 27, 28, he was commanding 10,000 men to prepare them for the front during World War I. And during that time, two officers or two soldiers anyway came into the camp with Spanish flu. And so Eisenhower had really a very varied background that weirdly, almost uniquely qualified him for taking a big leadership role during World War II. The fact that he ended up as Supreme Allied Commander is really a remarkable story, because it's the first time in warfare actually that an integrated Allied force was put together, and his supreme command for the first time in military history enabled the Supreme Commander to have control over the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Believe it or not, past wars had been organized more like a committee structure. And so he was extraordinarily powerful in the most important phase of the war, which is the assault on the Normandy coast, and then the progress to bring about the end of the war. So on the Normandy side, it's an iconic place, of course. I hope people have a chance to read this chapter, because it's called Accountability Without Caveats. And I think it's remarkable, actually, that Eisenhower was quite insistent that if he was going to have the control over everything, he was going to take responsibility for literally every element of the operation, and that responsibility would be his and his alone. He carried a note to that effect, expecting to release it should the invasion fail. And I think that part of the story is very, very well known. What's less well known is that probably the success of the operation revolved around an airborne drop. This was the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne Division. And just days before the assault on Normandy, his commander of airborne forces warned that they would be annihilated, and suggested to General Eisenhower that he not deploy the airborne forces. And Eisenhower had to make a very, very courageous decision to use them anyway. He believed that probably the planning was better than that, and that he didn't anticipate numbers of that sort. But still, it was a very frightening warning just on the eve of D-Day. History tells us that the numbers weren't anything like the 50 to 70% casualties that were predicted. But still, it took a lot of moral courage after he said, let's go, to go out and visit those two airborne units before they deployed for Normandy, looking in the eyes a group of men who were leaving for their uncertain fate with some pretty dire predictions behind them.
And I know we could spend the rest of our conversation talking about his many triumphs and challenges in World War II. But we only have an hour, and we have many principles to go over. But he did have the foresight, and I think that's a big part of being a leader, is to look ahead. And he understood the importance of documenting the atrocities that happened in World War II, and even having being of German descent, but he understood how important it was. And I was really struck by the stories that many of the reasons that we have the documentation, that people can't go back and say this didn't happen, was because of his foresight as a leader. And I was wondering if you just talk a little bit about that.
Well, Beth, I think this is really one of the most important stories, and I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I can say as his granddaughter, so now this is me talking, that in reading about the history of this, I was always so struck by how well he managed internally the absolutely horrendous things he saw during that war, and how he must have felt to have to assume full responsibility for everything that was going on in this theater. On April 12th, he and General Patton and General Omar Bradley went to Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald. It was so bad, the scene, that you could smell dead and decaying flesh from miles outside of this camp. And when they got there, even George Patton couldn't go through the whole camp. It made him physically sick. But Eisenhower, with his kind of steely resolve, decides to visit every nook and cranny of this camp, and literally on the spot decided that everybody who was within any proximity of this camp, this would be GIs and others, should come into this camp and all the other camps they discovered to chronicle what today we call the Holocaust. Now, as soon as they left the camp and got back to Patton's headquarters, Ike writes General Marshall, who was the chief of staff of the Army and architect of World War II, basically, and said, I want you to send as many people as you can, reporters, members of Congress. They must come chronicle this, because 50 years from now, people are going to say that this never happened. Now, the fact that he made that decision while he's looking at this horrendous site is already noteworthy. And I also think that it's noteworthy because later he said that he was so horrified by what he'd seen that he literally confessed that there weren't words in the English language that could capture it. And here you have a picture of, you can see how he's got his hands on his hips. This is a pretty angry, pretty determined Eisenhower. And there were a number of inmates there that you can, I think they're to the right of that picture, who, recounted what happened at that camp. This wasn't even one of the death camps. It's just that the carnage began as it was clear to the German officers in charge of that camp that they were losing the war. So they just started killing people and piling up bodies like cords of wood. In any case, Eisenhower, was resolute on this subject. He had the Army make a film of it and then forced ordinary German citizens to watch the documentary. And right after visiting Ohrdruf, which was near Gotha, he sent the mayor and all the townspeople through the camp. He wanted them to see what they'd done or what they, it was so bad, the scene, that the mayor went home and he and his wife shot themselves that evening, just because they themselves had known what was going on, presumably, but just couldn't even handle what they'd seen themselves.
Given all of these painful experiences that he had during the war and decisions that he had to make, how do you, this is really more of a guess, being the granddaughter, but how did he remain optimistic and humorous and not become cynical?
Well, I think this is really something worth noting. I mean, people who are subjected to, first of all, that kind of responsibility, imagine how you might feel at times knowing that you are sending people to their deaths, sometimes making decisions before, metaphorically speaking, your second cup of coffee. This is an immense responsibility. I think he must have at some point had to really come to terms with the question of good and evil. I don't mean to make that sound simple by any means, but it would be very hard to have a philosophy for life that was as optimistic as his was without coming to terms with it and finding some kind of internal peace about it. And then, he had many ways to cope with the other stressful decisions he was making, for instance, during the presidency. The advent of the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb changed absolutely all the rules of warfare. And what's sort of intriguing about that is that he was the guy who put together the architecture for this transformational period in the military nuclear area. So that responsibility could not only bring about a third world war, but the end of civilization itself, given the destructive capacity of the hydrogen bomb. How did he handle this? I don't know. It remains an enduring mystery. I was in on so many family occasions, and then I overlaid that with the crises he was managing, and I never saw as a kid any indication of this. He managed somehow to be extraordinarily engaged with his grandchildren, coming to our my sister's ballet recitals and my horse shows and my brother's swimming meets. And I don't know, he didn't get there as often as I'm sure he would have liked, but he was a very engaged grandfather. So I think one of the things oh my goodness, this is an interesting, how wonderful. This is when Granddad came to speak at my school, Westtown. This is about a year and a half before his heart attack. Let's see, he died in 1968. This is 1967. He came to speak to the student body, and did they have fun giving him a hard time? Because I was at a Quaker boarding school, which is a very distinguished school, but the Quaker religion, as you know, is based on conscientious objection to war. And actually, few people realize now, why would the Eisenhowers send their granddaughter to a school like that? Well, my own grandfather was raised in a pacifist household. His mother was a part of, oh my gosh, there we are, right? We're walking down the staircase. Anyway, he gave a wonderful speech and managed to connect with my classmates in an extraordinary way, especially when he confessed to the big man on campus that Dwight Eisenhower, had been in a state of despair when he discovered that he couldn't play football anymore because of a knee injury. And I'll tell you, the students absolutely loved that. And then he told the student body, well, I did all the things kids do when they get that disappointed. I started doing, I took up smoking. I did this, I did that. He suddenly went from being, a warmonger in the eyes of the student body at Westtown to being just a regular guy who, was just like the rest of us.
Well, there's so much about his career in World War II, but I know that many of the guiding principles in his leadership style came forth when he became president. And I think it's just fascinating that he was really courted by both the Republicans and the Democrats. And so can you comment on, he even was gifted an elephant? I believe there was a story about that. How did he feel about being courted by both, and how did he choose the Republican candidacy?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Dwight, and there's some debate about this in the scholarly community. There's no debate about this in the Eisenhower family. Eisenhower had other things he was planning on doing with his life, but and I think was frankly exceedingly naive to think after the war that he was going to be given any opportunity to fade off into the distance and do more fly fishing and enjoy leading a major university. In truth, the first big job after Chief of Staff of the Army after the war was to be NATO's first Supreme Commander. And imagine we might never have gotten NATO off the ground if it hadn't been for, oh my gosh, this is absolutely unbelievable. Yes, there were at least several efforts to give Ike an elephant after he decided to run for president. And yes, he was courted by both parties. He was embarrassed by the attention, et cetera, but finally decided, since the Republicans had been out of power for 20 years and had not actually had a winning candidate for president since the Great Depression, that a two-party system in the United States was absolutely critical. So you can imagine, once he decided to become a Republican, and nobody knew what party he was from because he was a military general, and they don't declare that. And actually in those days, they didn't even vote in elections. So suddenly everybody wants to give him an elephant, which is, of course, a symbol of the Republican Party, including his brother Edgar, who went out of his way to outline all the great things that this elephant could do, like play with Shetland ponies and bow and stand on his hind legs and do all these wonderful things. And you can see Ike's face there like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me, because he writes back to Edgar and says, I have enough problems without adding the care and upkeep of an elephant. Now, the problems he was dealing with, of course, were trying to get the budget of the United States under some control, to end the Korean War, to bring his new colleagues along in terms of signing up for supporting international endeavors, including NATO and the United Nations. So the last thing he needed was to figure out how to feed and care for an elephant. Oh, you know, what a job, right?
What a job. And really to have the foresight that we do need a two-party system in this country, and possibly even a independence. And I know that we can talk a little bit about your family and choosing to be independent. But you describe in your book that let me remind everyone, I have so many questions of my own, but I know that each of you all out there in the audience may have questions. So please feel free to write them in and I will weave them in. I have one for Ray Termini that I'm going to be saving for a little bit later as we get into the presidency. But you described, so please send in your questions, everyone. Describe him as a strategic leader, not operational, and that he was not interested in the minutia, and put a system in place where he got feedback from all of his staff. Can you talk a little bit about his leadership style as in that context?
Well, sure. Of course, you know, to explain this in a rational way, of course, he was at the early parts of his career was an operational leader. He was commanding Camp Colt, which was the only tank unit we had in the United States. And he was a very big advocate for tanks and also their advanced usage in the case of major war. And later he was given a job in the 30s as Douglas MacArthur's assistant and the rest of it, but he also played an important role in helping the United States devise a plan for ramping up industry and the rest of it in case of war. He had a lot of operational jobs, and that's what made being a strategic leader of value. In other words, he had been through the acquisition process. He knew about acquisition. He knew about tanks. He had a job after World War I to write a book about the American battlefields of France. He knew every village intersection in France because he had walked all those fields in the 1920s. So this operational experience actually gave him enormous background. But I think his real gifts, as you say, Beth, thank you for this point, is that he was a brilliant strategic leader. And what I mean by that is that he had the intellectual bandwidth to be able to bring all of the various elements of an operation together and to strip down a problem to figure out what the most important issues were and how to tackle those issues. I mean, think about it. During the war, he had bosses who disagreed with each other. He had subordinates who were challenging, to say the least. He had to marry all of that with actually the strategic leadership for the war itself. So how did he do that? First of all, for those who felt sorry for Dwight Eisenhower because he had so many personalities to deal with during World War II, I was actually fascinated to discover that when he gets to the White House, he sets up the White House very much in the same way. He surrounds himself with people of divergent viewpoints. And I think he had found that during the war, as trying as it could be, he actually gained a lot from hearing the perspective of different people about strategy, because what it would do is clarify his own mind. And he was very uneasy with the idea that one man would have all the answers. And so getting this feedback, and by the way, this pushback, gave him an opportunity to see the full dimensions of any issue. So his own cabinet was reflective probably of his family dynamics. There were conservatives, there were moderates, and there were liberals in his cabinet. And all of them were expected at their weekly cabinet meeting to be able to speak on any topic, even outside of their own department's issues. And this meant that he was getting feedback that really reflected the views of the American people and experts in those specific areas. I think it's interesting to note that Richard Nixon said that he never made a decision alone. I mean, never made a decision at a cabinet meeting. He always took all the input, and like he did during the war, retreat to solitude to make his decisions.
And thank you for the questions. And I do promise I'm going to weave them in, but I wanted to just continue on this theme a little bit about the philosophy, or really his guiding principle of the middle way. And I think we hear that now, and I don't know, maybe in our polarized society that we have, the middle way may seem, weak, but the reality is he had to make peace with his enemies. He had to at least hear other points of view. So the middle way really is quite profound. So can you talk about his philosophy and the middle way that he used?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Honestly, these questions are just spectacular. And that is an excellent one because, yes, you're absolutely right. I think today, Beth, that people think the middle way is some kind of little soft place. No, I mean, in Eisenhower's view, the middle way is where the action is and where the brave stand. Because what it requires, and he was very adept at this, it requires looking at an issue or someone's position through their own eyes. In other words, and I think it takes a lot of courage to look at the world and a specific set of issues through the eyes of others. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to cave in or necessarily, but you have to know what the context is of issues from other people's perspectives. And then the middle way, what this is really a gathering place for people on either side of an issue to come together to forge a win-win situation for progress. Now, if that looks weak, it's only because we have decided in our society that compromise is weakness. No, compromise in Dwight Eisenhower's mentality is the only way to move something forward. I think it's fair to say today, because of our divisions and because of this notion we have that digging your heels in and not giving an inch of strength, actually it's a form of weakness. It's a winner take all type of position. How can we have a country where winner takes all? And then finally, let me say, as a strategic leader, as president of the United States, he had to do the same thing he had to do during the war, which was to unite the effort, because without a sense of national unity, he knew perfectly well that the communists, that would be the Soviet Union and their satellites and the Chinese or whatever, would exploit our differences and undermine our national security. So I've spent a lot of time in the national security field myself, so I've already been outspoken enough to say that what we've got going on today is a national security threat. And we've basically given any country that doesn't go along with this a roadmap on how to further divide this country. Ike was going to have none of it. And you can see in the way he responded to civil rights and other issues that he took a principled position that we were going to move forward in terms of progress, but we were going to do it bringing along everybody to the extent that that was possible on such a sensitive issue. In any case, he did name his 8 years in the White House the middle way. And I think it's a very compelling part of his legacy.
And I think we look at today as being very divided, but we were united during World War II, but after World War II, we became a very divided country, and McCarthyism sprung out. And you have an excellent, if not a whole chapter, but a big segment about how he handled not giving McCarthy a platform and not attacking him directly, because that would raise it to the level of being presidential if you acknowledge it. But that's a very difficult position. And I know he probably received criticism for it.
Oh, he did. Oh, Beth, I've got to tell you, not only did he have people in his administration pressing him to call out Senator McCarthy by name, he had family members who were, pressing him to do that. But here's his calculation. Again, this is General Eisenhower, now President Eisenhower. He was very adept when analyzing a problem. We should start with, what does he control? Okay, any military supreme commander would be thinking about, what do I control? What are my assets and my liabilities? Okay, in the asset department, he controlled the executive branch, and he was also, as our Constitution tells us, head of his own political party, and also head of state. So he has to rationalize these three completely different job descriptions that, but as head of the executive branch, he did not control Senator McCarthy. It was the Senate of the United States that controlled Senator McCarthy. And the complexity of this particular issue was that Senator McCarthy was a member of the president's own party, and that the Republicans who controlled the Senate at that time and the House actually supported Senator McCarthy. So the president had a very tricky thing, which is he couldn't censure Senator McCarthy, but if he were to insult Senator McCarthy on a regular basis, then he would not get the cooperation of the Senate leadership to ultimately censure Senator McCarthy, which he successfully did. It took a while, but if he was going to insult Senator McCarthy and call him out by name, then the other senators were very likely to circle the wagons and to side with Senator McCarthy. This was a no-win situation. So he played this game behind the scenes, and it was actually very deft, but it took time, which of course was a very tough thing on all fronts. Again, Eisenhower understood that keeping this country together and sorting this out in a way that did not further disrupt the United States standing in the world was very tricky indeed.
And I did ask for questions, and now I have them. So we have Ray Termini, and he wants to know about that President Eisenhower supported the 1953 Iranian coup that overthrew the democratically elected prime minister. In hindsight, it's always easy to, backseat quarterback or backseat drive or whatever the phrase is. Why do you believe that President Eisenhower thought this action was necessary? If you can go back and look in his mind.
Well, first of all, I can't really look in his mind. What I have to do is to be relying on his diaries. And thank goodness he kept a diary, because these diaries offer all kinds of insights into his position on political things. May I also suggest that if people get a chance to read a fascinating book called Eisenhower the President by William Ewald. And it's in Ewald's book that we understand that things were a little bit more complex than they have been represented. And that is that, I would say that there are two factors to this. Number one, if you look at the Solarium Project in 1953, there are a couple of things that happened right after Ike becomes president. First of all, by early March, Joseph Stalin, the absolute leader of the Soviet Union, died. And then Eisenhower discovered that the Truman White House didn't have contingency plans, not that they would be, fully relevant, but he starts a contingency exercise called the Solarium Project. In the course of this, Eisenhower institutionalizes basically the strategy for the Cold War up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The reason for the background on this is that it's important. Eisenhower did not believe in small wars. He did not believe in small wars. He understood that there were only two ways now with the advent of the hydrogen bomb. There was either going to be relationship management or there was going to be the catastrophic end of civilization. That is with the Soviet Union. What is a problem about the way the Iranian story is told, I believe, is that it takes into consideration a couple of things that we don't know, or at least I haven't read the book related to it. And that is what the Soviet Union was doing in Iran at the time. Certainly the administration thought that that Mossadegh was, had deep ties to Moscow. I don't have any way to confirm or deny that. I didn't, this was not one of the case studies I used in my book. But let me just say what I learned from Ewald's book, which is absolutely fascinating, is that it wasn't until, I believe it's 1956, but it's in a chapter called Ike's Rules for Good Governance, that Eisenhower actually had veto power over the CIA. There are many people at the time that thought that the CIA was like the Federal Reserve Board that had full independence of action. And so Eisenhower made a concerted effort over his 8 years to rein in the CIA, including their capacity to go ahead with operations that they themselves deemed important. So again, I don't have any way to evaluate, without having studied this issue, how much Eisenhower actually approved and how much the CIA did on a freelancing basis. It's a great question. Maybe at some point I'll have the opportunity to take that up as a subject, because I have studied Soviet history. But you know, the Soviet archives that were once opened for a short time are now closed, and I'm afraid, unless the archives have already spoken on this subject, we'll never know what the Soviet Union was doing in Iran at that time.
Well, I'm so glad that he did keep diaries and that you have that inside look into not only what he was thinking, but really what was behind some of these decisions.
Well, Beth, if I could just add to this, Eisenhower was so fed up with the CIA by the time his second administration was over, he did say to General Goodpaster that I never want to be alone in the room with any of those guys, because the CIA misled the President of the United States about the U-2, which was this aerial surveillance over the Soviet Union that was kind of what you might call America's unilateral open skies. We offered the opportunity for the Soviet Union to overfly our territory, which did not come to pass. So we went ahead and did it anyway, because we needed to protect ourselves against a surprise nuclear attack. But the CIA were not direct with them. Did not tell him the truth about some things. And so there really was, I think, a fair amount of tension between the CIA and Dwight Eisenhower. And again, if you look at that 1956 executive order, he tries to rein in the agency. Again, I think there are some excellent books out there on that subject, but it wasn't until I read Bill Ewald's book that I understood that. And furthermore, there's a fascinating chapter in that book about the church committee hearings and how key people in the Eisenhower administration were not even invited to come in and testify. Ewald was one of the most knowledgeable historians on this subject, since he was an editor of Eisenhower's memoirs, and also had a deep exposure to this while he was in the White House himself. So I hope that that's of some use to your questioner.
Absolutely. Ray Termini, I hope so. He's one of our best members and attends all of these. So thank you, Ray, for that insightful question.
And a great question, yes.
Great question. And maybe another book.
Yeah, there we are.
So we have another question. And as I'm looking at the time frame that he was president, a lot of our citizen exchanges started during this time period. And this one is specific to the people-to-people citizen ambassadors program, started in 1956. Mm-hmm. And he believed so much in connections and uniting people after all that he had seen during the war. I think he realized this was one of the next step in preserving our civilization. Can you talk about some of these exchanges and specifically the people-to-people ambassadors program?
Yes, well, the people-to-people citizens ambassador program, yes, is certainly very much a part of that 1956 effort. But a few people realize how many other dimensions there were to that 56 program. That includes the Sister Cities program, which was part of this Eisenhower initiative. Many other organizations were founded around that, and eventually found their own independence. But the Citizens Ambassador Program is an excellent example of what he had in mind, which was to expose both the United States and the Soviet Union and Americans to other parts of the world where we could break down some of these stereotypes and barriers. I mean, this is at a very, very dangerous part of the Cold War, where government propaganda, coming especially from the communist world, offered a very different view of what American life was like and what the American people were like. And this was one way to, begin to crack away at this hard propaganda shell. And I think it has been transformative for many people who traveled to some of those parts of the world where people didn't know us as well. And let's not forget the jet aircraft don't really come onto the scene until the late 50s. It's kind of hard to imagine that, isn't it? But this program predates that. Also, I'm very proud to say that the World Food Organization that just won the Nobel Prize was initiated by Dwight Eisenhower during his term. He thought that fighting world hunger was extremely important. He believed in CARE, which is a very important program that looks at providing relief for people overseas. Alliance for Progress, it was later wonderfully picked up by the Kennedy administration. The initial funding for that program was achieved during the Eisenhower administration. He was an internationalist that believed that the American people had a role to play in America's image and also in showing America's heart.
And we have quite a few questions that I think we can bundle together in terms of his legacy. And I, in your book, and I think maybe it was in an interview, the polls for different presidents, at one point he was ranked down at the bottom, and now he's moved up, and it really shows the perspective is what we need to judge a presidency. So I would love for you to comment on that, and then also maybe weave in how much the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. means to you and your family. Just some reflections on his legacy.
Well, that's thank you so much. That's an important question. You know, right after his presidency, he was ranked, I think, 22 out of it'd be 33 presidents. He was the 34th. Which is, I don't know whether it's a passing grade or not, but not really. And, you know, there were a lot of critics that sort of lined up. We went into a very contentious 1960 election, and a lot of that came from Democrats who were trying to carve out their new way in the post World War II era, who were restless with this kind of disciplined approach to what kind of engagements we were going to be what kind of military engagements we were going to be involved in overseas, etc. And I say that without judgment. It's just a fact that it was a very, you know, hard-fought, contentious election in 1960. And that image of him prevailed for quite a long time. But I think a couple of things happened, and I can say this again on a personal note, is that my grandfather really didn't have deathbed wishes per se, but the one thing he did ask us to do was to get the Eisenhower archives opened as quickly as possible. And he said that he had always been in support of that. Even the World War II archives, he thought, should be open to the American public. He believed in transparency. So he said, get those archives open as quickly as possible. And he said, warts and all. He actually said that to his family, warts and all. I mean, we're not going to go through the library and cherry pick the flattering things and the unflattering things, warts and all. So that's what happened. I mean, my family and I still play a role at this, have tried to get everything we can out to the public because that's what Granddad wanted. And then in doing that, weirdly, it changed the trajectory of the assessment of him, because he did have a number of tools in a strategist toolbox that people didn't understand. This is working behind the scenes, working through others, allowing other people to take credit. And suddenly the picture of Dwight Eisenhower looks very different by the time you get to the late 80s, after an important book by Fred Greenstein called The Hidden Hand Presidency. So those are a number of factors. And I mean, it's astonishing when you think of that trajectory. Recent poll of historians places Dwight Eisenhower number 5 in the pantheon of, you know, 44 presidents at this stage. So that is quite a rise. So it's very moving that this has sort of been memorialized literally on the Mall in Washington, D.C. I will say quickly that probably some form of this would have happened anyway, because there are only 2 other, I think this is fair to say, 2 other presidents of the United States who fought major military operations victoriously, and also had 2 terms as president. And that's George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower. So it might have been at some point inevitable that some kind of recognition of that would be in play. But I think what has emerged is a absolutely wonderful memorial to both his wartime supreme leadership and his 2-term presidency. And it's a wonderful place. I hope everybody gets to come visit it. It's also a shout out to the great state of Texas and also the great state of Kansas for his upbringing and his roots. And stands as a monument really to the people who also served with him. And Beth, if I could say, the thing that is really thrilling about this for the members of the Eisenhower family who knew and loved this man is that he's not alone in his statues, and he wouldn't want it any other way. This is a man who always talked about teamwork, who understood that he was making the big strategic decisions. Even when he was an operational leader, he was managing his units, but it was always about the team and it was always about others. So I think it's a very, very fitting memorial on the mall. Thank you.
Very timely. And learning about Ike the man, I think was fascinating to me. And he had a wicked sense of humor, and he also paints. I think it's interesting that many former presidents take up painting, but there was one, I don't know, I think it just puts everything in perspective about the weather. Do you want to share that comment about how you're worried about the weather? I think that it's something we all need to remember.
Well, it's I guess as he rose through the ranks and took on greater and greater responsibility, part of the thing about strategic leadership when you get into those positions is that the ultimate decisions rest with you. So you've got to be able to delegate. You have to do all kinds of things if you want to meet really massive objectives like ending the war in Europe or orchestrating a 2-term presidency that was all about the modernization of America. This is what the 50s are, is the technological revolution underway and everything else like that. So while he's thinking about a new set of rules of the game, after World War II, he took up painting and he used it to center himself, to your point about painting. But he was very disciplined. There are 2 things, and I'm going to get your point here in a second, but I hope our listeners will, find something in this, is that according to my father, who was an intimate of his father, they were very close, and my father was with him at many important occasions. He used to say, your grandfather was brilliant at not rewinding the tape. In other words, not thinking about all, he learned from his mistakes, but he didn't rewind it in a guilt-laden way that would then prohibit him from being able to move forward. So that took a lot of discipline. Anyway, he had a philosophy about power, and one of them is don't sweat the small stuff. And every day I'm trying to tell myself not to sweat the small stuff, and it's not that easy. But anyway, there's a wonderful story because Milton Eisenhower, his youngest brother, had a very distinguished career as a university president. He was at Kansas State University, Penn State University, and he was president of Johns Hopkins University twice, which is a story all of its own. But while he was at Penn State, the newly elected Dwight Eisenhower was invited to come give a convocation speech or something, and it was destined to be, I was scheduled to be outside where they could accommodate really a huge audience, and Milton was all excited about it. But then the weather forecast got pretty bad and, iffy. It was one of those annoying forecasts where it's supposed to drizzle and then, it might have a downpour and this and that. So over breakfast, he says to his older brother, Ike, he said, should we move the convocation speech inside, but we won't have as large an audience, or should we keep it outside? And just while Ike's having his breakfast, he's, buttering his toast and drinking his coffee. He says to Milton, Milton, it's your problem. I haven't worried about the weather since June 6, 1944. Well, I'm worried about the weather tonight. I want to take advantage of the last, warmish weather to sit outside and, get outside of my tiny apartment. But I was very philosophical about stuff like that. And he was quite disciplined about knowing which things ought to occupy his worries and which things should be handled at a different level. Oh, well, so poor Milton had to move everything inside, I guess. And that's that story.
Definitely puts it in perspective. I'm
Yeah, it does, right.
when I'm worrying about the weather, for the fate of the civilized world rests on the weather. And anyway, so thank you for sharing that story. And we just have a few more minutes together, and I've just enjoyed this so very much. I guess there's a couple of questions here, again, about his legacy and about your relationship with him, and I'll maybe combine these two. What is your favorite personal memory of the president, and what would you say is maybe would he feel is his greatest lasting achievement?
Oh, I spent, we lived in Washington for the last couple of years of his administration. And then we lived on an adjacent farm in his retirement. So there are so many moments that are so special. It's almost difficult to single one out, but he had a kind of warmth and he loved kids, and he really loved kids. And this comes through, during the war, after the war. I've used some examples of that because I call it when no one is looking, which is my way of saying that character matters. It really matters in a leader because it's the basis on which trust is solidified, and people only follow people they really trust unless it's a totally transactional relationship. In any case, to give you an example of what kind of a grandfather he was very interested in my riding career. I don't know how much of a career it was, but I did ride his large overfed horses, mucked out the stalls, and generally tried to be helpful around the farm. I won a walk trot competition once at a horse show. I think it was my first horse show. And the cup, the trophy, again in quotes, was about 2 inches wide and about 2 inches tall. Really pretty pathetic little cup, but it meant a lot to me. Apparently it meant a lot to him too, because about 2 or 3 weeks after I won that trophy, he had something all wrapped up like a package, and I opened it up, and he had taken that little cup out and had it put on a pedestal. So it's one of my prized possessions. I have this little dinky little cup on a pedestal because he thought it was one huge deal. And that kind of positive reinforcement we were getting as kids all the time. I've got many more stories, including the time the horses I was responsible for ran over his golf green, but I'll let the readers of this book read that for himself. In terms of his overall legacy, and I've had to stand back and actually give that some thought. And I think that they're just a couple of them. Obviously, the defeat of Nazi power was enormously important. Well, it's probably the most important thing he did with his life in a way, because had he not been victorious on D-Day, let alone bringing about the end of the war, then he would not have become president. That's very clear. But I think the one area where it's overestimated a little is the fact that he committed the United States ultimately to a bipartisan consensus on America's role in the world. Remember that when he tagged his 5 stars to the Republican Party in 1952, the Republicans were an isolationist party at that time and wanted to come home from our international commitments. The effective leader of the party, Robert Taft, was an isolationist. He brought 8 years of peace and prosperity. He built the interstate highway system, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the first reconnaissance satellites, the framework for outer space, the putting aside of Antarctica, the Alaska Wildlife Refuge. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I think the key there is he did this while and modernizing, establishing the FAA, NASA, it goes on and on, while balancing the budget 3 times in 8 years and getting very close on another 2 occasions. That means that he took a warfare state, which was, bringing about the end of the Korean War and fashioning that in to a peacetime budget, and balancing that budget, leaving his successor with a surplus. And then finally, and may this serve as something to aspire to as we go into an election, because whoever is elected, we as the American people have to make our voices clear that we are better together than we are divided. And that's another thing that Dwight Eisenhower did in his 8 years. He brought a fractious and frightened America together, and built out of that a sense of confidence and can-do spirit that stood us in good stead for a very long time to come.
Well, thank you so much. And we had other questions that I think you covered them. We did have one from Darcy Anderson, who's a good friend of the World Affairs Council, and he actually met your grandfather when he came to Dallas and spoke to a West Point group. So we just have such a love for him here. Texas born. I'm sorry I got that wrong in the beginning, but thank you so much. We are so grateful for your time that you've spent with us today. And I know Kirsten had some closing remarks as well.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to quickly come on and say thank you again for you both for being here. This is a delightful conversation. On a personal note, the mall in Washington is one of my favorite places in the world to be and reflect on our country. So I cannot wait to visit his memorial in person. Quick shout out to our webinar sponsors. Thank you again for your dedication to the World Affairs Council and our mission. And again, please purchase a copy of How Ike Led at interrobanebooks.com. Of course, you can enter the code dfwworld on our online store to receive 10% off your purchase. I hope to see you all there. Thank you all and have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.